I've worked in 9 different kitchens in my career, and everyone has their own recipe or version of a plated Black Forest Gateau. And beautiful fresh cherries are one of my favourite things. So after seeing everyone else's over the years, I decided that this is one of the first things I wanted to put my stamp on. So here is my full recipe for my plated Black Forest Gateau. So the first thing we're going to do is cook the base for the mousse. All we've got in the pan is the cherry juice, sugar and the cream. We're going to heat that up until it's boiling. So once the mixture is boiling, what you're going to do is just take it off and we're going to pour it over the egg yolks. And then we put it back in the pan and bring it up to 82 degrees. So that's now come up to temperature to 82. And all you're going to do is go straight in with our soaked gelatine. And then just dissolve that gelatine into your mix. And then using the heat that's already in there, just going to pour that mix over the chocolate. And use the heat of the actual mix to melt the chocolate. So once it's all emulsified, all we're going to do is just cover it with cling film and then leave it to cool down to 31 degrees, which is the perfect temperature to fold in the cream. So the next thing we're going to do is just to whip the cream quite lightly. If you over whip the cream and it's fairly thick, then what you're going to get is just a split mousse. But if you really, really under whip it, all you're going to do is affect the consistency of the mousse. So pop that on the machine. So now what we're going to do is put the mousse in the freezer to set, and we'll pop them out when they're frozen. So I've got both mixes here. So this is the base that's now cooled down to 31 degrees, and also the cream, which has been lightly whipped. And all we're going to do now is just mix them together. So the next thing I'm going to do is just mix in a little bit of cream into the mousse, just to loosen it slightly, using a whisk. To loosen up the base a little bit, just so it's not so thick when you add it back into the cream. And then all we're going to do is take the base and then fold it into the cream. So all I'm going to do is just fill up my piping bag with the mousse. And when you cut your hole, you don't want it to be too small, because the more you try and force it through a hole that's really small, you're going to over whip the cream and probably split the mousse in the process. So you want a nice, big, medium hole. And then all you're going to do is just pipe it in to the top. And we're just going to smooth over the tops of the palette knife, just so they sit nicely on the plate. So to make the glaze for the cherries, all we need to do first is to mix the sugar, the cherry puree and the cocoa powder together to a paste. We do on the stove so it's nice and together. And then before we do anything else, we add the cream and then bring that whole mix to the boil. Use a spatula or a maurice to scrape the bottom because it will burn very easily and you'll end up with a bitter tasting glaze. So next I'm going to add the gelatine. You're just going to pull the pan off and let it cool down slightly before you add the gelatine, as not to denature the proteins inside. And you really want to make sure you squeeze out all of the gelatine so you're not adding any extra water into the mix. So the next thing we're going to do is just pass off the glaze, and we're going to get rid of anything that's hanging around inside the glaze, any undissolved gelatine, anything like that. And then we're going to skim the top once it's cooled down to get rid of any impurities which are going to affect the shine of the glaze. So now that the glaze is cooled, just slightly, all we're going to do is skim the top to take off any bubbles and impurities that will affect the shine of the glaze. So the next thing we've got to do is the crumble for the cherry dish. We've got all the dry ingredients here in the bowl of the mixer with the paddle attachment, and then just the melted butter in a bowl on the side. And all we're going to do is just mix the two together to a crumb. So now the crumble is mixed together, and it's quite a loose crumb. You don't want to let it go too fast, it becomes a paste. I'm just going to take it off of the machine and then spread it out onto a tray, ready for the oven. Okay, so now we're going to put the crumble into the oven. It's about 170 degrees, around about 15 minutes, but we're going to move it around while it's cooking to make sure it doesn't set in one big lump. So now the crumble's been in for about 7 minutes, and you just need to make sure you move it around during cooking, make sure that it doesn't stick together in one big clump. So we're going to take it out of the oven now. And just mix it up a little bit, just to make sure it doesn't set in one go. And then we're going to pop it back in the oven for another 5 to 7 minutes. So the next thing we need to do is make the syrup, the kirsch syrup, to soak the sponge. All we've got here is the sugar and the water in the pan. We're going to boil it, then take it off and add the kirsch while it's cooling down. So the first thing we do is heat up the sugar and water to a syrup. So now when the syrup is boiled and the sugar is dissolved, all you've got to do is take off the mix, and then we're going to leave it to cool down a little bit before we add the kirsch. And then we just leave that on the side until we're ready to soak our sponge. So now the time has gone off for the crumble, after the second time it's been through the oven. All we're going to do now is just take it out and leave it to cool. So the next thing we need to do is to make our sponge for our cherry dish for the bottom. All we're going to do first is to make a French meringue. And then we're going to make the same kind of thing with egg yolks as well. We fold them two together and then fold through our dry ingredients. So the first step we need to do is to make our French meringue. I've got egg whites on the machine here, and I'm going to whisk them until they're starting to foam. We're going to drizzle in the sugar and then keep it going until the meringue is nice and thick and glossy and aerated. So all we're going to do now is take off the meringue from the first part of our sponge, put it in a bowl on the sides, and then we're going to use the same bowl to make the egg yolk pâte bombe. So now all we're going to do, we've taken the first meringue out of the bowl and popped it on separate. Now we're going to use the egg whites to make a kind of a sabayon. All we're going to do is pop the egg whites sugar together in a bowl and leave them to whisk up until they're nice and thick. So now the egg yolks are whisked up with the sugar. All we're going to do is take that off, and we're going to mix it together with our French meringue that we've already made and our dry ingredients. So I'm just going to mix a little bit of this meringue with the egg yolks just to loosen it a little bit, and then just fold those in gently as you go. And then when the egg whites are almost into the mix, then you're going to start to drizzle in your dry ingredients. You want to try and get all of the stuff in as quickly as possible so that you don't over-mix it and knock all the air out. Try a nice light mix so there's lots of air bubbles in there and soak up all of that kirsch syrup we're going to soak it in. And when you've got all of that dry ingredients through and the mix is nice and smooth, all we're going to do now is just spread it onto our tray and bake it through the oven. So now what we can do is just spread our mix onto our tray before you bake it through the oven. You use a long palette knife and just smooth out to the edges, trying not to overwork the mix too much. So now what we're going to do with the sponge, now it's spread out on the tray, is just to pop it into the oven at 160 degrees. So now the sponge has been in for about 10 minutes, and we're just going to take it out and leave it on the side to cool. So now we're going to make the chantilly cream, which is basically just a sweetened vanilla cream for our cherry dish. I've got in the bowl the cream, a little bit of scraped vanilla, and the sugar, and we're just going to whip that up until it's nice and stiff and ready to pipe. So now we've got all our elements together for our cherry dish. We're going to start to plate. We've got a glaze for our cherries, which we're going to pop out of the freezer, our mousses. Our sponge, which is going to be soaked in our kirsch syrup. We have a little bit of chocolate crumble, some ground pistachios, and also a little bit of cherry jam to stick the crumble to the plate so it doesn't run all over the plate, and our chantilly cream, and also a few fresh cherries as well to lift the dish. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is to spread a little bit of cherry jam on the bottom of the plate, which will hold our crumble in place. You can use honey or a little bit of neutral glaze if you like, but a little bit of cherry jam is appropriate for this dish. So we're just going to soak our sponge in our kirsch syrup. And then we're just going to place it right in the middle of the dish. And then we're just going to pop the crumble around the outside to level out with the sponge. So our cherry mousses, which have been in the freezer, now they're nice and hard. We're just going to pop them out of the moulds and use a small cocktail stick to dip them into our glaze and then pop them straight onto the dish.